Hi, happy Sunday, everybody. My name is Jamie Weinhauer Martin. I have lived in Maricopa County, Arizona for many years, since 1982 exactly. And during my career in Arizona, I spent about 30 years at American Express in their corporate card division for travel-related services. During that 30-year time period with American Express, it included a time frame of between 2012 and 2016, where I was the liaison between American Express and their third-party vendors. I was responsible for the oversight if a situation happened. Let's say we promised a card member membership reward points for 5,000 membership reward points if they spend $500 in the first 3 months. And let's say they met that criteria, they spent the $500 in the first 3 months, but we didn't give them the 5,000 points. We only gave them 1,000 points. That would have initiated what's called a corrective action plan. We need to look into that and see, did it just happen to one person or did it impact a larger population? So American Express was a regulated industry. There's lots of regulated industries, but we can use contracts in the state of Arizona as a regulated example as well. In regulated industries, essential systems are governed by procurement contracts. Same thing in the state of Arizona with outside vendors. These contracts define how services operate with safeguards. Safeguards must exist. That's called a corrective action plan. And how vendor performance is monitored would be a typical, you would expect that to happen. You would expect regulated industries to have systems that are governed by some type of a procurement aspect. When a major operational event occurs, such as the 2020 pandemic election, something unusual, disruptive, or high risk happens, there's a standard governance practice. That governance practice is to conduct a contract compliance review. If risks or violations are identified, organizations open a corrective action plan to analyze the problem, correct it, and prevent it from ever happening again. The way they can do that is by monitoring and probably some licensing that's in there too. That's what's called governance. That is the governance question that I began asking in Arizona after the 2020 pandemic election. Here's the question. Why do I focus on vendor contracts when most election investigations focus on ballots or machines or counting? Well, because the contracts, and that's my background, are the governance layer that actually controls how the election systems operate. Government relies on private vendors to provide services that support election administration. Those relationships are governed by procurement contracts. In regulated environments, when a major event occurs, auditors normally examine the contract itself to determine whether the vendor followed the contract terms to the T, whether contingency plans were adequate, please remember that one, whether controls functioned properly, remember that one too, and whether improvements are required going forward, which always would be, they do if there's a big situation that happened that we need to take care of. If risks or violations are discovered, a corrective action plan is open. That's what you do. But they didn't do that in Arizona, and I've been trying to ask them why since around 2021. If risks or violations are discovered, a corrective action plan is opened. How the complaint and compliance process works. During my time at American Express, when a potential compliance issue surfaced, it entered a formal escalation process. As a business systems analyst, I often served as a liaison between the operational teams and the compliance officer. When an issue appeared, the first step was, let's do some root cause evaluation, right? We asked straightforward governance questions. Did the vendor fail to follow the contract? Did the issue originate internally, such as incorrect instructions or scripts that maybe American Express provided to the vendor? Or did the issue initiate at the vendor and therefore we need to go to the vendor to make that correction? Was there a system or process failure? Or was the situation something that simply required monitoring and improved controls? This evaluation typically began immediately after the event was discovered, not years and years later, often within the first day or two. Actually, within 48 hours, you're supposed to report a corrective action plan and have it entered into some type of system so it can be tracked. If the issue was determined to be a violation or significant risk events, then the compliance officer and that liaison, myself, would decide whether to open a corrective action plan. What a corrective action plan actually does. A corrective action plan essentially does about 7 things, okay? A corrective action plan is essentially a structured remediation project plan designed to resolve the issues completely and forever. It typically runs about 90 days and includes several essential steps. 1, the first step is identify the root cause of the problem. Step number 2, determine who or what was responsible. Was it the vendor, the internal process, or some type of system failure, or another human failure, human issue? Identify the impacted populations who may need remediation. So in other words, stop the bleeding and remediate the people who are impacted by the issue. Provide the remediation and make affected parties whole. Stop the immediate issue so the problem does not continue. Implement stronger new controls so the issue can't repeat. And establish ongoing monitoring to ensure that the solutions continue to work. Now remember back to the 2020 election. The contract that was used for that election was used again in 2022 and 2024, and the same contract may be being used again for 2026. In other words, a corrective action plan does not just fix it once, it puts referees back into the game and to the system, so the problem cannot happen again. What happened in the past 4 elections in Arizona was that there was no referees in the game. There was no corrective action plan at all. Why this matters in Arizona: the 2020 election was an unprecedented operational event, and in most regulated industries, that type of event would have automatically triggered a contract compliance review of the vendor supporting the system. The review would ask basic governance questions such as, did the vendor follow the contract? Were contingency plans adequate? And were safeguards sufficient for an event of that scale? If risks or deficiencies were found, a corrective action plan would normally be opened. That didn't happen in Arizona, you guys. However, after obtaining the election vendor contract through public records and reviewing it line by line, the question became unavoidable. Why didn't the audits and investigations examine the contracts that govern the system? So what contracts am I talking about? My original request asked for the contracts used to validate and certify the 2020 election. Specifically, the 2018 service level agreement that had 3 huge anomalies in it. The biggest anomaly was that 3 pages of Exhibit C disaster recovery policy was struck through during the pandemic election. The only other policy that was Exhibit C, which is the disaster recovery policy, was dated 2011 and 2016. And I asked my leaders, why? Doesn't that mean that the contract that was signed 90 days into the pandemic by our procurement department on June 4th of 2020, why was it signed 90 days into the pandemic with strike-throughs and disaster recovery and corrective action language written throughout the contract? This was specifically for Runbeck. I did get the Dominion contracts too, but I stopped at Runbeck because I was appalled at what I saw when I went through that contract line by line. Yet they used it to certify that election. And then they used it again in 2022. And they used the same contract again in 2024. And that's why we saw repeated issues, because they never did a corrective action plan after the contract was used post-pandemic election. Why I escalated the issue. Arizona law already requires corrective action plans in areas such as Medicaid and education. Yet even in those areas, the process is often treated as a formality rather than the rigorous oversight tool that it's designed to be. Seeing the gap is why I raised the issue to leaders across Arizona over the past several years. I asked a simple governance question. If a major operational event occurred, why wasn't contract compliance review conducted? And if necessary, a corrective action plan initiated? That's a really basic compliance question, you guys. It needs to be answered, and you need to help me demand it in Arizona. Those questions should not be controversial. They're basic accountability principles used across regulated industries. My personal motivation. My father, Coach Bob Weinhauer, spent his career in professional and collegiate basketball. He coached at the University of Pennsylvania, worked with the Philadelphia 76ers, served as an assistant coach with the Atlanta Hawks, and later worked with organizations such as Minnesota Timberwolves and Milwaukee Bucks, eventually serving as vice president of basketball operations during championship seasons with the Houston Rockets. Now, he also coached in Arizona, and he also coached in Illinois. All of those states that I just mentioned seem to have the same violation where there's no corrective action, no going back to the contract after that 2020 election. And because runback was used in each of those states, I'm assuming that the runback contract was pretty much the same in each of those states. One thing my dad taught me is you don't sit on the sidelines and watch the game. When you see a problem in the game, you step onto the court and you play, or you at least make sure referees are in the game so it's fair. Right now, what I see across many systems is something similar to a game without referees. Oversight mechanisms that should be active are not being used. A corrective action plan is one of the tools that puts these referees back in the game. I'm demanding that they utilize it in Arizona. Modern election systems operate through governmental procurement contracts with private vendors, and meaningful oversight requires reviewing these contracts and initiating corrective action processes when major risk events occur, and actually ongoing, such as the 2020 election. The points that I'm making here are reasonable and defensible, and here's why. Election systems rely on government procurement contracts with private vendors. Election jurisdiction contracts with private companies that are used for printing, tabulation, support, logistics, IT services, and related infrastructure require oversight. Contracts define operational safeguards and responsibilities. Procurement contracts typically specify service levels, contingency planning, reporting obligations, and performance requirements. Major operational events often trigger compliance or performance reviews in regulated industries. That's standard practice, including financial services and government entities. Corrective action plans are a common compliance tool used to remediate identified risks or violations. Corrective action plans, CAPs, are widely accepted and used in regulatory environments. The description of the compliance escalation process, which is root cause analysis, remediation, controls, monitoring, matches common risk management frameworks. There is no reason that we as a state in Arizona shouldn't be the catalyst to stop these systemic issues from repeating over and over again. So I'd like you to join me in requesting corrective action plans in every single state. Once we do that and we put a safety net in the complaint process, we will no longer see these issues repeat. Thank you for your attention to this matter.